Hello, this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and today's video is about the force required to break a grit out of the bond material, depending on the grit size and depending on the hardness or the grade of the bond. So if you are a grinder, you might find this useful. If you are producing grinding wheels, you probably will find this useful. And if you are developing bond formulations and putting that in the grinding wheels in various concentrations and various mixtures, then you should find this useful. So this is pulling data taken from a guy named M.C. Shaw. And M.C. Shaw is one of the world grinding gurus. So let's take a look at what he did. And so here is a paper from M.C. Shaw back in 1964. Now, you might say in 1964, things are different. Hey, grinding technology has evolved. It certainly has. And bond technology has certainly evolved even more than grit technology. But still, the fundamental concepts apply. Harder bonds, softer bonds, bigger grits, smaller grits. So this is some work done by Shaw and Peklenik. He's a Yugoslav grinder from Slovenia, I believe, maybe Croatia. And so let's take a look at what they did back in 1964 when the Beatles came to America, I believe. So let's take a look. And I've taken their graph and then I have jazzed it up a little bit, colorized it. So we're going to go through this slowly. We're going to go through this step by step. It's going to take a little time and we want to get a handle on this. So what we have on the left is the force required to bust out a grit. So they had their little gizmo here, and I don't show it very well, but they had a little chisel that they dragged through the grinding wheel, and they used a vitrified bonded wheel with various amounts of bond in it and different grades. And then they measured the force required to pluck that grit out. Now, they claim that is the bond force. You could also argue that they're breaking grits because they use white alumina in this, which is the friable grit. But we will go with what they tell us and say, okay, this is the force required to bust a grit out of the bond material. And then they got a distribution of forces, and I believe they took an average of these forces. What we have here is the force, and the absolute value is probably not that important. I plotted it here as kilograms. I think they gave it in pounds. You really should probably do it in newtons because officially kilogram is a measure of mass, not a measure of force. But still, we tend to think in terms of kilograms more than newtons. 10 kilograms, 22 pounds is 10 kilograms. And 10 kilograms is 100 newtons. Okay, so there we have the force required to bust a grit out of the bond material. And then over here on the x-axis, we have the amount of bond inside the wheel. So as you stick more and more bond material in, you get a higher grade wheel. GHIJKLMN. Now, as I teach in my class, everybody has their own formulation. So Norton's H is 4% is not going to be the same as Tyrolus H. 5% is not going to be the same as Radiax or Noritaki's. And then even then, the different bond formulations have different percentages. So that gets very complicated. But it doesn't matter. What we're going to do is just look at what Shaw did, Shaw and Peklenik, and see what they came up with. So let's take it one step at a time. Let's go through this slowly. Let's start with the big grit. 24 mesh is a relatively big grit. Okay, those are big grits, so I've drawn those in blue and I've made the grits big. Later we'll get the smaller grits, and the smaller grits I've made small and I've given them a different color. Let's start with the 24 mesh grit. When we have only about 3 or 4% of bond material, it's not that difficult to bust the grit out of the bond material because we just don't have a lot of bond material holding the guy in place. Then we add in more bond material. Actually, it's quite a bit more. Even though it's only 1 or 2%, relative to the original, it's quite a bit. So we go from, let's say, 3.5% to maybe 5.5%, something like that. And now it takes a lot bigger force to bust that grit out of the bond material. Now, why does it take a bigger force? Because there's more bond materials holding the grit in place. When you have more bond material holding the grit in place, it's just harder to bust them out of the bond material. Then if we put in 8% bond, it's really difficult to bust that 24 mesh grit out of the bond material. Now we need 9 kilos. 9 kilos on one little 24 mesh grit. Okay, 24 mesh is, how big is the diameter of that? 60 mesh is 250 microns. 24 is more than double. So maybe 500 or 600 microns, almost half a millimeter in diameter for those guys. Okay. Now let's move to 36 mesh. 36 mesh in red, we have the same general curve. As we put more bond material in, it gets more difficult to bust them out of there. Now we'll do a comparison in a minute between grit size. Then we have the 46 mesh. Now grits are getting smaller, 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 smaller. And now we have a 60 mesh. So 60 mesh, the grits are about 250 microns in diameter, which is about 10 thou in diameter. And what we see is as we add more and more bond material, it gets more and more difficult to bust that guy out of there. And you'll notice that they did the 24 mesh and they went as high as 8%, but the 60 mesh, they went as high as 18%. Now that's really a huge amount of bond material. What would happen if you put in 18% in a 24 mesh? It'd just be damn near impossible to bust them out. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's more difficult to bust out big grits than small grits. And then we'll go out to the 80 mesh. 80 is still a relatively big grit, so they did this over a range of pretty big grit sizes. And 80 mesh, we still got the same trend. As we add in more bond material, it gets more and more difficult to bust that guy or bust that gal out of the bond material. And they have given a grade here. Now they've given H to J to L to N to P. Now, I don't trust those grades, or at least I don't think they have any meaning in the relative sense of the term, but an H grade in a Norton might be an I grade, and a Noritake might be something else in a Tyrolite. We know that, but still, that's HIJKLMNOP is how they divide it up. H would be considered soft, N would be hard, P would be super hard. So far, so good. Now, let's stay at a certain bond percentage. Now, they drew grade like this because that's the way they did it. Everyone has their own system when it comes to grade. So it's not a straight up and down, but let's go straight up and down. And let's say we got 6% of bond material in the wheel. If I've got 6% of the bond material in the wheel, I got my 80 here. I've got my 60 here. I didn't do a green at that, but we can eyeball it and say it's about there. The red 36 is there, and then the blue would be, say, up here. So what can we conclude now? What we conclude is it's a heck of a lot easier to bust small grits out of a wheel than it is to bust big grits out of the wheel. So if I've got 6% bond material in the wheel, it's going to be really tough to bust that grit out of there if it's a 24 mesh, big grits. But if I've got 6% bond material for an 80 mesh, it's not that difficult to bust them out of there. In fact, the ratio is 0.4 kilos up to 6 kilos is 15 times about. So it takes 15 times as big a force to bust out the 24 mesh as it does to bust out the 80 mesh. Now, we know in general that bigger grit wheels wear more slowly, smaller grit wheels wear more quickly. That's why typically, all things being equal, and not all things are always equal, but all things being equal, we want to go with the biggest grit size we can get away with, because typically bigger grits can remove material more quickly, and bigger grits will give us less wheel wear. However, be careful, because you might be inclined to say, oh my God, look at that. That's a 15-fold difference. That 80 mesh wheel is going to wear away super quickly compared to the 24 mesh wheel. That's only true. It's going to wear away somewhat more quickly, but not incredibly more quickly, because if you have an 80 mesh wheel, you have just a lot more grits in there. If you have a lot more grits in there, you have a higher cutting point density. If you have a higher cutting point density, it means that each grit is going to penetrate less deep. And if each grit penetrates less deep, you're not going to have as big of forces acting on the 80 mesh as you are on the 24 mesh. So the 24 mesh is going to have a low C value if you're an academic grinder. And that means you're going to have a higher cutting point density. So those grits are going to be close together for an 80, far apart for a 24. They're going to penetrate, just throw out a number, they're going to penetrate 1 micron in the 80 mesh, and they're going to penetrate 2 microns in the 24 mesh. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have smaller forces overall acting on the 80 mesh compared to the 24 mesh. And so your wheel wear is not going to be as vastly different as this chart would suggest. It's going to be different. You're going to get probably more wheel wear in the 80 mesh than you are in the 24, but it's not going to be vastly different. And in the book of grinding, I have examples of people who have done tests with various grit sizes. And what they found is that, yeah, okay, an 80 mesh wears somewhat faster than a 60 mesh, but not hugely faster, 20% more, something like that, but not as much as this chart might suggest. So now let's go to, say, the 80 mesh, and now we're going to stick in 19% bond material. We're going to get a P grade wheel. Now, P is crazy hard. That's super hard. I almost never see a P grade wheel. I consider an N grade wheel pretty hard. I show an example in the book of grinding when I do my course of an extremely dull wheel, and I point out that was an N grade because the bond just refused to release the dull grits. And so you can get an extremely dull wheel in an N grade. It's pretty difficult to get an extremely dull wheel in an H grade. You can do it, but it's more difficult because the grits are just going to pop out as soon as the forces get bigger. Okay, or to put it another way, if you are going to achieve a super dull wheel in H grade, you would have to grind very, very gently at a low grit penetration depth in order to keep the grits from busting out. Okay, now, what else can we say about this? So we've said that we pack in more bond material, we get a harder wheel. Fair enough. We have more grits in the bigger grits. We'll take a bigger force to bust them out of there. And that's simply because we have a big grit, we have a more bond area contacting the grit. And so it's just going to be, we're going to have to fight through and bust through out more bond. More bond is going to give us a lower stress on the bond because there's just a bigger bond area holding the grit in place. So what that means is for wheel developers, when they start developing smaller grit wheels, they have to put more bond material in there. Now, not incredibly more bond material because they also have a higher cutting point density, but typically you have to put in more bond material. I did a LinkedIn post today where I talked about a customer who was doing cylindrical OD grinding with a short arc length, which means the forces on the individual grits are very big. And on top of it, he was putting a form threads into the cylindrical OD workpiece. And the company, for whatever reason, I won't say the name of the wheel manufacturer, suggested an H grade wheel. And I said, I don't think so, man. Cylindrical OD for an H grade wheel? No. Unless you're grinding some extremely difficult to grind high-speed steel or a nickel alloy and you're obsessed with burn, there's just no reason to go with an H grade wheel. And this was a standard, easy to grind steel. So I said, nope, let's not do that. Let's go harder because this is a cylindrical OD operation. It has a short arc length that's going to get bigger forces on the grits. So we need to go for a harder grade wheel. Now, Shaw and Peklenic put in their designation for what they say is the grade. So the H just didn't go straight up. They didn't say, hey, if we got 6% of the bond in the wheel, we have an H grade. They could have done that. That would have been okay, I suppose, because wheel grading is an arbitrary way to do things. It's a lot of hand waving. It's a lot of how do you really define an H? It's all relative. So they could have said, hey, man, we're going to say 6% is an H, and we're going to say 8% is a J, and 7% is an I, and 9% is a K, and 10% is an L. And we're going to do that regardless of the grit size. And it would be one way to do it. But what they said is, no, hold on, we're going to define L. And when we start getting into bigger grit sizes, L will mean less bond material in the wheel. And J is the same way. This curve doesn't go straight up, it curves over. So we're going to say, hey, if you want a J grade in an 80 mesh, you get 8% of bond material. If you want a J grade in a 24 mesh, you get only 5.5% bond material. And again, to complicate matters even more, this is for one particular formulation of bonds. And wheel manufacturers have many, many formulations of bonds, depending on the different constituents they put in, depending on what temperature they bake it at, how long they bake it, how hard that bond is going to be, how strong it is, how tough it is, a lot of factors going into that. So this is just for one type of bond material. And if we chose a different formulation of bond and repeated this test, God forbid, because this test probably took some time to do, but if we took a different bond formulation, all these values would be different. And all of a sudden now, 8% bond in a J wheel on an 80 mesh takes double the force to break if we have a stronger bond. And that's why bond formulations can be a little maddening, because you really don't know in absolute terms how hard it is to break. Now, you know in relative terms that an N grade is harder than an L grade is harder than a J grade. But then as soon as you start changing bond formulations, or as we see here, as soon as you start changing grit sizes, things are going to change. So one of the things I tell my customers is if they're not satisfied with their surface finish, they should not dress the wheel dull. They should go with the smaller grit size. And then the wheel manufacturer, hopefully when they go for a smaller grit size, will know that, hey, we also have to change the bond formulation for the smaller grit size and how much bond to put in the material. And bond formulations are a whole nother science. They get very complicated. And unfortunately, the wheel manufacturers don't publish their results for all their different bond formulations. So in all the academic literature about grinding, there's a lot of good information, but there's not a lot of information about bond formulations and how they work. So I hope that was helpful. This is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, talking about the fundamentals of grinding. And you might think, hey man, 1964, what the hell? I want to learn the state of the art of grinding. If you're going to be a good grinder, you need to know grinding. You need to know fundamentals, first principles. Newton's laws of motion haven't changed in 400 years. Actually, they haven't changed in 14 billion years, but they haven't changed in 400 years since we first learned Newton's laws of motion or figured them out. So when I took physics in college, we were learning Newton's laws of motion, and I'm sure the kids these days now are still learning Newton's laws of motion, and no one's complaining saying, hey, you're teaching me old technology. No, because the fundamentals apply regardless. Now, bond formulations have improved greatly. Grit properties have improved somewhat, so the greater gains have become in bond formulations. But still, you need to know the fundamentals, and you need to know how this stuff works. And thanks to Shaw and Peklenik for helping us get a better handle on it. So this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc. These are slides from the 4,000-page book of grinding, which is given to people who attend my grinding course.